Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning or this afternoon. My name is Emile LeBrun. I'm an independent researcher in small arms control. Our moderator, Anna Alvazzi, who's also a senior small arms expert, she will join us when she can to take over the moderating functions. But basically, let me introduce this session. This session is called Has the Firearms Protocol Helped Reduce Violence? Or evaluating the Firearms Protocol in terms of its violence reduction impacts. Basically, what we hope to do in this session with interventions from myself and my colleague, Christian Ponti, and our respondents, Nicolas Fauquin and Simona Grassi, we would like to explore the possibilities for evaluating the impacts of the Firearms Protocol on violence reduction in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, especially SDG 16, 16.1, and 16.4. What we hope to do is unpack the challenges for developing an evaluation or an assessment framework for the Firearms Protocol, and how such an exercise like this can support the recently established review mechanism of the Firearms Protocol and the related Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. So what I'd like to do is introduce Christian Ponti, who will make the first intervention of the session. He'll introduce the Firearms Protocol and some of the key issues that we'll be discussing. And then if Anna is available to come back afterwards, she'll come back in there, but then we'll proceed with the interventions after Christian. Christian, can I give you the floor?
Thank you very much, Emile, and many thanks also to Global Initiative and all the staff for having organized this interesting event. My presentation, as Emile already participated, aims to trigger our discussion. I will briefly address some introductory remarks on the link between the Firearms Protocol and armed violence. I will approach to this topic from the angle of international law, which is my expertise. A turning point in the international momentum for the regulation of illicit firearms was in 2001, when the UN General Assembly finally adopted the protocol against the illicit manufacturing of and trafficking in firearms, their components, parts, and ammunition, supplementing the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, UNTOC. This event occurred almost in parallel with another UN conference, aiming to more broadly regulate the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons in all aspects. The sharp disagreement that accompanied the negotiation in New York finally resulted in the adoption of the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, which is a political, non-binding instrument. On the contrary, the general awareness of a strict connection between illicit firearm trafficking and transnational organized crime offered a unique criminal policy opportunity to reach a final agreement on the adoption of the Firearms Protocol, which is, I remind you, the first binding global treaty regulating firearms. The Firearms Protocol is a crime control instrument. It aims to prevent, combat, and eradicate illicit manufacturing of and trafficking in firearms. The Firearms Protocol addresses the links between illicit arms trade and armed violence, as well as other sustainable development goals, in a very nuanced way. The preamble of the protocol, for instance, echoing the words of other global instruments on arms control, asserts that illicit manufacturing of and trafficking of firearms endangers the well-being of people, their social and economic development, and their right to live in peace. Notwithstanding this promising premise, no substantive provision of the Firearms Protocol expressly touch armed violence issues. By ratifying the Firearms Protocol, states parties make a commitment to adopt and implement in their domestic legal framework several crime control measures. Core obligation upon states parties deal primarily with four areas, namely the establishment of criminal offenses related to illicit manufacturing and illicit firearm trafficking, authorization and licensing systems for firearms, marking, record keeping, and tracing of firearms, and finally, cooperation. How shall we concretely measure the impact of these crime control measures on armed violence? In my view, a tentative answer to this question requires a comprehensive analysis of the outcome of the Firearms Protocol's implementation process. Unfortunately, 15 years after the entry into force of the Firearms Protocol, an effective knowledge of the implementation of its normative framework domestically, which should also include an evaluation of actual compliance of states parties with such norms, is still lacking. This unsatisfactory result is above all the consequence that in the past years, the monitoring of the Firearms Protocol implementation exclusively relied on self-evaluation by states parties under the guidance of the Conference of the Parties of Untitled. This practice indeed encountered several difficulties. Notwithstanding the enormous efforts to these purposes of the Secretariat, UNODC, it was able to collect only limited qualitative and quantitative information about the ongoing implementation process of the Firearms Protocol at national level. The establishment in 2018 of a review mechanism for the implementation of the Anti-TOC, which will also cover the review of all most relevant substantive provision of the Firearms Protocol, has marked a promising turning point. The review mechanism, which was launched last month in Vienna, provides for a mandatory mutual evaluation involving all states parties of the Firearms Protocol. The review mechanism will not only encompass a formalistic self-evaluation, but also a substantive assessment of states' performances. This monitoring exercise will be carried out by two peer reviewing states parties with the active involvement of the state under review. The process will not produce any form of ranking, and it is primarily aimed to help states parties to build their own capacities for implementing the Firearms Protocol. In years to come, the operationalization of the review mechanism, notwithstanding several flaws in its design, could provide an excellent concrete opportunity to effectively test the implementation of the Firearms Protocol provision into domestic legislation, as well as their concrete enforcement by the practitioners. This legal exercise might have far-reaching consequences, positively contributing to shed light on the impact that a more effective implementation of the Firearms Protocol would indirectly have on armed violence. There are several issues that will be further elaborated on this point by other panelists. Another promising feature, at least on the paper, and I move quickly to my conclusion, is that the rule for the functioning of the Firearms Protocol formally recommend states parties to engage the most relevant civil society stakeholders, namely academia, NGOs, and the private sector, both in the consultation and the assessment phase. I will eventually go much deeper on this point in our second run of intervention, if possible. Anyway, if the states parties will show a real political commitment, and this is one of the main challenges ahead, in supporting the role of non-state actors in the review mechanism, this would indeed increase the inclusiveness, transparency, and effectiveness of the implementation process. For instance, with the aim of maximizing the impact of the Firearms Protocol implementation process, academia and NGOs, in partnership with the willing government as well as other relevant stakeholders such as UNODC, could promote, alongside the activities of the review mechanism, multidisciplinary researches on existing synergies and complementarities between the Firearms Protocol and other global arms control instruments, such as the Arms Trade Treaty and the International Tracing Instrument. Initiatives like this panel look precisely in that direction. A possible achievement, and I really conclude, of an extensive engagement of civil society actors in the process could be, for instance, a comprehensive assessment of the impact of the Firearms Protocol as well as other global arms control instruments on armed violence and other linked SDG targets. I thank you very much for your attention, and I give back the floor to Emile or to Anna in case Anna returns. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. I think Anna is back, but she will rejoin us at the end of my intervention. So allow me to then thank you for introducing our theme and to introduce the Firearms Protocol to our group here and how it interacts with other international instruments that deal with small arms. I think just to highlight one or two points that you made, to reiterate that the monitoring of the Firearms Protocol until very recently was a compliance monitoring function. It was a implementation monitoring and not an impact monitoring. And what we're suggesting here is that more of an impact evaluation is necessary. And now that the review mechanism is in place, depending on how things go with the involvement of civil society, there's a space to do that. So I will then provide my comments, which were designed to be the second intervention to follow on to Christian's. And I think I hope to complement what he said which was more from a legal background, which is from my background, which is more of a public health sphere. So staying a little bit at the big picture, what I'd like to do is highlight a couple of the challenges that we see to connect actions that result from the Firearms Protocol at the state level with levels of violence. What I'd like to do is just sketch a few of these challenges, and then perhaps we can come back to them in the discussion part of this session. There are real challenges, but I don't think that they're insurmountable to the project that we're proposing. The first challenge is the lack of a clear sense of what relevant actions have been taken at the state level as a result of the Firearms Protocol. This is partly a matter of transparency from national authorities. Until recently, as Christian just outlined, there's not been a standardized process for states to report on their activities in a structured and robust way. This is changing with the review mechanism, but the review mechanism will involve information sharing primarily between states on a secure platform that civil society won't have access to. The review mechanism has a 10-year staggered progressive approach to its assessment, collecting information about the different thematic clusters in the protocol, preceded by a preparatory phase and leading to a report writing phase. It will take time before states begin to become active in this mechanism, and researchers' access to information gathered in state self-assessment phase will be very limited, or presumably will be limited. If civil society proposes additional types of assessments, as we are proposing now, to look at the link between the protocol and violence, we'll need to consider how they engage with the review mechanism process. And perhaps this is one of the important questions that we can discuss in this session. The second challenge is isolating the role of the Firearms Protocol, which is part of a broader set of legal and normative obligations that states have committed to, which Christian just mentioned, relating to firearms and criminal violence. The review meetings of the convention and the protocol, as well as the Arms Trade Treaty and the Program of Action and the International Tracing Instrument, increasingly speak of the goal of a comprehensive and integrated approach to firearms and criminal firearms use. The 2020 Working Group on Firearms from the protocol calls on states to adopt a national legal framework that takes advantage of all the provisions from all of these instruments. And at the same time, the protocol itself is not a monolithic document. It contains a number of different provisions, criminalization steps, prevention efforts, international cooperation and legal assistance, and so on. So on the surface, disentangling the measures and isolating them from the Firearms Protocol in terms of their effect on violence will turn out to be a little bit challenging. This is related to the third challenge, which is establishing causation, or at least an association between specific national laws and enforcement initiatives that flow from the protocol and changing rates of violence. This is not so straightforward, as measures take time to move from national commitments to reality, and it can take some time after a state ratifies the protocol that its laws are changed or revised, and even this tends to happen in phases. Once new laws are established, it then takes time for monitoring and enforcement mechanisms to become active at the national level. At the same time, some states will already have had some of these mechanisms and laws and regulations in place prior to their adoption of the protocol. So what I'm saying here is all of the phases of the legal process need to be ultimately clarified and unpacked when discussing their potential impacts on criminal activities and ultimately violence. Getting beyond association to something like causation or cause and effect would raise the bar significantly and would require controlling for a range of other important broad socioeconomic factors and crime factors, major events like peace agreements and economic trends, COVID, for example, and so on. But I don't think this is really necessary, because typically establishing an association is already interesting enough, or at least it's a very good place to start. And related to this last point, we do need to remember that violence is somewhat downstream from what the operative provisions of the protocol call for. The expected intervention logic that we're talking about is that national efforts to address illicit proliferation, illicit manufacture, and trafficking will reduce organized criminal activity in these areas, and that this will have an impact on violence levels, among other things. In this logic, the clearest outcome indicators would be not only the overall number of and rates of total firearm killings, but also the number and rates of firearm killings committed with illicitly manufactured or trafficked firearms and ammunition. But empirically linking illicitly manufactured firearms and ammunition and trafficked arms to specific instances of violence may not be feasible in many contexts, as relevant information may not be captured in public health or crime or other national databases. And furthermore, the Firearms Protocol doesn't require the establishment of such systems. So we're back to a bit making broad assessments, I would say. Finally, the immediate objectives of the protocol, that is addressing illicit manufacturing and trafficking in firearms, are not static phenomena, but are dynamic and evolving. They may evolve in response to measures that we institute, such as the effects of the Firearms Protocol on legal measures, or they may evolve independently of those. Illicit manufacture, for example, may evolve as a result of technological advancements and the accessibility of technology to criminal actors, and those could be largely independent of the steps that we take at the international level to deal with such crimes. This is one area that the Working Group on Firearms recognized and prioritized in 2020. Just to conclude, obviously the wider in scope, the more difficult the research effort. Looking at global levels of violence against which states have implemented the Firearms Protocol again versus which ones haven't may be a good conversation starter, but it won't get us very far in the end. Actually, despite the fact that transnational organized crime is the primary target of the protocol, implementation is always national, and this is where an assessment of violence impacts should take place as well. The methodologies that we employ will need to take account of the levels of existing information about legal steps taken and enforcement modalities introduced, total levels of lethal violence and illicit arms-related violence, arms and ammunition lost, seized, and captured, proportions of illicitly produced arms used in violence, among other things. In the absence of robust official data in these areas, field work and qualitative research, and probably most likely surveys, will be needed and combined by independent and objective research bodies. Independently developed assessments could allow for the comparison of effects in different states and the drawing of lessons that could enhance the implementation efforts of all states. And this is the area where I think the research community and civil society can make a particularly important contribution to this process. Thank you. If Anna's with us, I can turn it back over to her.
Yes, Anna is back.
Am I here?
Yes.
This looks really challenging. No, thank you. Good morning, afternoon, evening. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that we had some problems with IT, but this is the beauty of this strange period. We have learned a lot about IT. Anyway, I think it works well because I can say now some of the things that I would have said at the beginning, but now they make more sense because you have already heard from Christian and from Emile. So first of all, we are doing here what for us is quite an experiment, the catwalk format. I like this name very, very much, the catwalk. That means moving very prudently among obstacles, let's say, and making sure that nothing falls during the walk. So instead of showing results of work already done, we are venturing into new areas, trying to identify needs for research, needs for more studies that would be useful, especially in supporting the review mechanism, as both Christian and Emile have already explained. I would like also to mention a couple of connections between the Firearms Protocol and organized crime more generally. As you know, the protocol is one of the three protocols with the Transnational Organized Crime Convention. So it has been, say, forced into this mechanism so that the connection is very clear. For example, if you look at the data about firearm killings, you will see that there is a clear connection between firearm killings and killings committed by organized crime groups. So analysis has demonstrated that there is connection. So firearms are used by organized crime to commit their crimes, and this is a way, effective arms control is a way to address the operations of organized crime. And finally, there is an important connection that we see with the Sustainable Development Goals, because the reduction of illicit arms flows has been included into Goal 16 of the SDGs in Target 16.4. That includes a significant reduction of illicit arms and financial flows among the desirable targets that we should achieve by 2030 in order to get peaceful and inclusive societies. So in this discussion today, we would like to get some ideas to advance research on the impacts of the Firearms Protocol in reducing armed violence. And beyond the two presenters that you have already heard, we have invited two experts, two friends, to act as discussants, so to get the ball rolling, and present their own first ideas to start the discussion and to start the conversation. The first is Nicolas Florquin, and I hope that he will be able to speak now. Nicolas, if you are there.
Thank you, Anna. I think I'm all connected, all is good. Thanks a lot for inviting me to this crucial discussion. It's very nice to discuss these topics with in a brainstorm manner with so many experts. So thanks a lot. I want to make two main comments, drawing upon some of the work the Small Arms Survey has done in recent years on trafficking issues. And the first point is that to consider, I think, when thinking of evaluating international instruments, is consider that member states' own national perceptions of why they're joining these instruments might vary. They might not be always the same. Obviously, a country exposed to armed conflict or a country exposed to firearms-related terrorism might join for different reasons a particular instrument. And it's important to recognize that they might be looking for different outcomes than the narrower goals of the instrument itself. And just as a short illustration of this, I'd like to mention a project we worked on last year, actually in partnership with UNODC and the African Union, where we worked with 5 African countries, basically to look at the locally available indicators for illicit arms flows that they felt were important to monitor the problem in their countries. And in doing so, we basically developed a list of 24 indicators that we know various countries have used through our research in various regions, and to work with each of these countries to support them in prioritizing 5 that they would be interested in further operationalizing. And the interesting aspect of that prioritization process is that when thinking of illicit arms flows, because that was the key that they were asked to monitor, how do you monitor illicit arms flows? But they not only included seizure data, which is one of the principal indicators at the international level, but also indicators that have to do with the legal sphere. So, for example, are there appropriate weapons and ammunition management procedures to control state stockpiles? And that was very interesting because that's basically states recognizing that to prevent illicit arms flows, you also need to safeguard the legal stocks and to prevent diversion, and that diversion feeds into trafficking. So that's actually quite an interesting point they were making in that way. The other interesting factoid from that exercise that all 5 countries selected firearm killings as an indicator of illicit arms flows. So not just of armed violence, but of illicit arms flows themselves. So I guess the question is, how do we include these national objectives and perceptions of the key outcomes of arms control into such a monitoring mechanism, and how do you build that flexibility when evaluating an instrument? Because in addition to those common outcomes, you may have a lot of context-specific ones that are desired by states. With respect to the trafficking itself, and that's my second point, I think it's also important to note that illicit trafficking and illicit manufacture are not just fixed types of activities. They evolve over time. And the ways in which they evolve, that can depend on technology. So we all know of how 3D printing or the use of the internet has influenced the ways in which weapons are manufactured at home or are trafficked in several places. But we also know that sometimes the regulations themselves might lead to different types of trafficking. So the criminal networks will adapt to the regulations. So that's something we've seen, for example, in our work on converted firearms in Europe, where you had tougher regulations on handguns, which led or contributed actually to greater reliance on converted weapons in crime and by organized crime. And the question then becomes, I guess, and that's a tricky one, because on the one hand, it's a positive thing that criminals have to go through more trouble to get handguns, and so at least initially these handguns were less reliable than real handguns. But on the negative side, it creates a new type of trafficking, and the question then becomes, are the instruments actually adaptive enough to respond to that evolution of trafficking and illicit manufacture? And are they responsive enough and adaptive enough? And can they actually anticipate some of these new trends so that additional measures be taken to also tackle these new threats? So those are the two ideas I wanted to put out there, sort of two concerns based on our research, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you. Are you okay? Can you hear me now? I don't know, because every time it's a challenge. Okay.
Yes,
no.
we can hear you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Nicola. I think that we are collecting all this information, and it's quite important to see how different experiences that are apparently not connected between each other, but they seem relevant. They are relevant for our discussion today. By the way, this was Nicolas Florquin, who is the head of data and analytics at the Small Arms Survey in Geneva, because we didn't introduce you properly, Nick. And I would like now to give the floor to our second discussant, who is Simonetta Grassi, the head of the Global Firearm Program at UNODC in Vienna. Simonetta, if you are here.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all? Yes.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you for inviting me and UNODC to this important event, where we will discuss actually two topics that have not been always put so much into direct relation, which is the Firearms Protocol and its implementation and its contribution to actually reduce armed violence. And I think, as my predecessors have said, this is at first sight not something so straightforward, and also difficult to measure for many reasons, as was already highlighted. I would like to make a few points only, also because I would like to leave some time for questions eventually. First of all, the Firearms Protocol and its nature and its level of membership. As we know, the Firearms Protocol has been ratified as of today by 119 state parties. So as compared to the Organized Crime Convention, which is close to universal accession, there is, of course, still a way to go to reach universalization. And somebody, I think it was Emile, has already mentioned that there are also other instruments that contribute to the broader issue of addressing illicit firearms or small arms and light weapons. But in terms of accession to the Firearms Protocol, we see that there is still a long way to go, in the sense that major countries that are also arms producing or arms exporting countries have not yet ratified or acceded to it. But if we look a little bit closer, does the level of participation, or the members, the state parties, tell us already something in terms of armed violence? In part, yes, in part, no. For example, if we look at Latin America, we see that 75% of all homicides are committed with a firearm, which represent roughly 50% of all the reported firearms worldwide in the same period. So this is a region with high levels of violence, armed violence, and the level of accession to the protocol is very close, almost universal. There are several countries in the Caribbean missing, 2 in South America, and very few, and 2 in Central America. So it's a very high level of parties compared to other regions. Asia, for example, has a very relatively low homicide, and it's below the average. And also the level of adherence remains low. Now, we cannot just draw this as a causal nexus to say high level of violence, high level of accession, low level of violence and homicides, low level of accession. In between, we have, for example, Europe, with also a high level of accession and ratification level, but a different, a much lower level of homicides and homicides committed with firearms. And there we can say then maybe that it is curious to see that the majority of the countries that struggle with problems of armed violence have acceded to the Firearms Protocol. Countries that don't have maybe this high level of violence may have acceded to it as a matter of prevention, but also as a matter of, let's say, shared responsibility, to have a shared vision on the fact that we need to take concerted actions to prevent specifically the means through which criminals get access to the to the weapons, which is through illicit manufacturing and through trafficking at the end of the day. So this is my first point that I want to say. The Firearms Protocol is not directly tackling violence. It is also not directly addressing illicit possession, ownership, but it refers to two measures that are somehow the vehicles through which illegal firearms can be acquired. So addressing and enhancing the capacity, the responsiveness of states to prevent these forms of crime, including by establishing criminal offenses for these conducts. And the Firearms Protocol is one of the only instruments that actually obliges state parties, require state parties to establish these criminal offenses, and that provides clear definitions of these crime types. So it is, of course, an instrument that contributes to addressing the problem of armed violence in this respect. By having common shared definitions, shared approaches also to the enforcement of these norms through criminalization provisions, I think that we can say that there is a clear contribution to addressing and also reducing armed violence. But this is not enough, of course. Another point I wanted to make is that UNODC has also embarked in data collection and analysis to identify the dynamics and the trends in illicit firearms trafficking. So we have published in 2015 a first study, and now in 2020 a study on illicit firearms trafficking flows, which also measure the achievement of the SDG, in particular its indicator 16.4, which addresses specifically the reduction of illicit arms flows, amongst others. It also recognizes the linkages between illicit arms and financial flows with organized crime, with all forms of organized crime. So in this respect, again, the contribution is in this way, we can say maybe indirect, but it is there. It is there. What we could see is that this study is alone not sufficient to measure the direct contribution to reduction of armed violence, but it looks at illicit flows and it looks at what kind of data exist that countries have. But as Nicolas said, we have also embarked in a cooperation with Small Arms Survey last year and with several countries in Africa to see if there are also other indicators, because in order to get a better understanding on the extent to which measures that are included in the Firearms Protocol can actually contribute to improve situations that can lead to armed violence, we would need to cross-reference, cross-check more data that in part countries have, like data on the legal firearms, from manufacturing to transfers to ownership, but also information on the stolen and the lost firearms. Some data exist, many data exist, but are not easily shared. But all this data together can help states and also civil society getting a better understanding. So I mention this because we are also, as UNODC, aware that looking at the Firearms Protocol in isolation without connecting it to the existence of other instruments, without connecting it to the fact that firearms are vehicles to multipliers of violence, and so they are closely linked to other forms of crime. So we cannot look at them in isolation. So if you want to measure the contribution of the Firearms Protocol to addressing armed violence in particular, we have to have this broader connection. We have to look at the criminal context in which firearms appear and are used, not only whether it is in a criminal context or not, or in the context of an armed conflict, but also what type of arms are being used, in which crime type in particular, for example. So these are the points that I think are important. And I want to conclude by saying, yes, the review mechanism is new and it has taken many years to negotiate it. And also the review mechanism alone may not give us an answer to this question unless we accompany the mechanism with some accompanying efforts to analyze the context of the self-assessments that countries will conduct, and to accompany countries in that sense in getting a broader understanding on where they stand and where the international community as a whole stands with regards to the implementation of the protocol and to the impact that it may have. Positive impact, or also negative in the sense that it contributes to reducing numbers that we hope will be reduced, which is the number of arms that are in circulation, the illicit arms, and hence also the impact on through by ways of killings or use of firearms in crime, for example. So in this respect, both the study, the data that UNODC is collecting and analyzing, but also the cooperation with civil society organizations, like the way what we had initiated last year with the Small Arms Survey, which is an example, are all geared towards raising the awareness on the fact that we need to bring much more information and data together to get a broader understanding. And I want to conclude by saying that 2020 marks also the decade of action to achieve the SDGs, and that the Firearms Protocol is, in my view, my personal view, a direct contribution to the achievement of the SDG 16.4. And in that context, I think we can also look at ways to strengthen the monitoring capability of both civil society and countries to also measure, but appreciate also its contribution to reducing armed violence. I think I took more than 5 minutes. Sorry for the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Simonetta. That's fine. Luckily, we are still good with time, so I think this is working. No, thank you very much. I think we have already a lot of elements on the place, and I've been informed that there are a couple of questions already in the chat. If anyone wants to ask questions, please put your questions in the chat. I think we have one question we received that is related to, okay, it says, I'm interested in this session because I work on wildlife crime and some commentators are advocating a wildlife crime protocol, although I am skeptical. So am I, can I add? Okay, I am already aware that there are mixed views about the effectiveness of the human trafficking protocol, so I am keen to know how we have fared with firearms. I think I will just say something briefly, and then I will see if our panelists want to say something on the questions that I will read one after the other. About this one, I think it raises an interesting point, that is the convention fatigue that perhaps Simonetta can confirm. That is what I mentioned earlier, that the Firearms Protocol found its way into the package, let's say, together with the Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, together with the protocols on trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants, because it was a good way to put together several instruments that could be dealt with by the same conference of parties, etc. Indeed, it's very difficult to think of new protocols, but who knows, it's always one possibility. And the second question that is more technical is some indicators and studies were mentioned, but they are inevitably a bit short of a full impact evaluation, given the complexity and heterogeneity, both problems, countries, and interventions. Period. Is that evaluation possible? In that case, how do you imagine the methodology to measure their impact and which information would be needed? Yes, before I give the floor to the panelists again, I would like to say that, of course, we have been thinking of what would be needed. I think that there are several examples of evaluations of international instruments and domestic laws. So we can see, for example, the types of evaluation that monitor, I don't know, how countries have implemented the international instruments, how each country has reacted, let's say, with domestic law, and what is the effectiveness of that domestic law. And there are also systematic reviews that assess the impact of firearm laws in some countries. There are assessment of firearm acts and firearm laws at the domestic level. So there is already quite a lot of literature to get inspiration from. And as Nicola said, there is already quite a lot of indicators that can be looked at. So some data are there, some data are already available. So it would be a pity not to make use of them to support the review mechanism. So is there any other question at this point? I don't know. No. Who wants to respond to these questions or to the discussants? Christian, you want to address something that has been said by Nicola and Simonetta, as well as the questions?
So actually, I would like to make some comment on the point raised by our discussant. I would not enter on the question of methodology and how to have an assessment impact indicators, because it is not my field. So actually I prefer to not to take a position on that, because I do believe that Nick, for instance, is more competent than me to answer to this question. Going back to discussion points of view, I do believe that a common view among all of us panelists is that implementation, or effective implementation, it is quite relevant and quite important in order to assess how the Firearms Protocol may have an impact on armed violence, either by means of direct indicator or by means of indirect indicator. To this purpose, I think that, as I already tried to point it out in my previous presentation, that strong commitment of civil society stakeholders to engage in the review mechanism, or at least alongside the review mechanism, would be quite important to this achievement. There are, of course, several challenges, but some opportunities as well. If you take a look to the review mechanism, for instance, there are some entry points for civil society, both relevant to this purpose. For instance, if you take a look at the consultation phase of the review mechanism, states parties, we know, are encouraged to consult with the civil society stakeholders in order to feel their self-assessment and in order to fulfill the self-assessment questionnaires. Of course, Emile correctly argued there are challenges on this point. But in any case, civil society has an opportunity to concretely act and to make available, for instance, as we are looking at on this, right, in this panel, to make researches and to make comprehensive researches and studies on the implementation of the Firearms Protocol. And with this result, civil society stakeholders could lobby and could assist government in providing information that will help states to implement the Firearms Protocol provision, as well as finding best practices, gap and shortcoming, and so on. I think this is really important, because the experience of other review mechanisms, if you take a look, for instance, of the anti-bribery convention monitoring system, a more open attitude and a more open dialogue between government and civil societies in the consultation process, it's quite helpful to build confidence and to increase mutual trust and cooperation, as well as transparency between states. And I think this should be considered a good reward for states to involve civil society stakeholder in the process. Moreover, as we know, according to the rule of the review mechanism of GI-TOC, academia, NGOs, and private sector could also be engaged in the assessment phase, participating to a process which is called constructive dialogues. This is a new term that we didn't know before. It's labeled to refer to the attendance of the civil society in the assessment phase. It is not clear yet what these dialogues are expected to produce substantially. I'm concerned, as everyone, from the fact that these dialogues will take place only after working groups have concluded their session and adopted their final reports. Anyway, these constructive dialogues are the main engagement point for civil society, and it is a channel to try at least to build synergies with willing governments presenting against results, outcomes coming from independent studies on ways how to improve the implementation and compliance with the Firearms Protocol. Of course, being an optimist to this respect, scientific finding could also have an impact on policy making, encouraging and lobbying for broad domestic legislative reform processes. If you want to be more realistic, which it should be our case, this kind of researches and studies may nonetheless contribute as an advocacy tool, at least to make pressure on governments in order to have more accountable attitude in the implementation of process of the Firearms Protocol, as well as in the implementation process of other arms control instruments. And this, in my view, would be per se a great achievement. That's all I wanted to say, Anna.
Thank you very much. I realized I kept my video on. Thank you, Christian. I think we are getting close to the questions we are getting from the chat. We have now two questions that are actually connected to each other, because one is in general, it says, how has the work of Small Arms Survey in Geneva contributed to the analysis of this issue? And perhaps Nicolas can then address this later. And the other is a question on gender-based violence. Could the implementation of Firearms Protocol directly, indirectly address gender-based violence? What would be some useful indicators and methodologies to assess such impacts, such as the collection of sex disaggregated data? And Emile has done work on this. So perhaps, Emile, you want to address this now? Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, I'd be happy to try. And I just maybe in the course of a couple of collection of comments responding to what's been said already as well. I really take away from what's been said that there's so much that's already been done, so much experience and research in different areas that we can feed into this, this research effort that we're talking about to connect the protocol with its impacts on violence in particular. I was struck by Simonetta's comment that, you know, that and she introduced basically by saying, we really haven't done this before. We don't really usually put the Firearms Protocol together with violence. And I think at sort of armed violence, I mean, criminal violence, yes, but in general, in terms of the SDGs and things. And I think what I wanted to sort of comment on was maybe to take what Christian said and turn it around a little bit in terms of, he discussed the fact that civil society, the role that civil society has in the review mechanism is a little bit vague, it's unclear, it depends on the interest of states to bring researchers and civil society in, and even then at a late stage, and how can we press governments to do that, to be more proactive. And I think the way I would see it is to turn the question around a little bit and say, you know, how can we get states on board with the research initiative of this kind? How can we make it attractive to them? Given the fact that a lot of the effort is going to happen behind the closed doors of civil society. And we don't have a really clear, or I don't really have a clear sense of all of the information that's going to be collected as part of the self-assessments and the evaluations. But I would take as a point of departure and a sort of starting point, the fact that probably some of the indicators that we're talking about in this forum are not normally going to be part of those self-assessments and those evaluations. But then how would we convince states that the project that we're talking about on violence impacts has value to them? And I think I see two potential areas. The first is I think that we can make the claim to states that doing the kind of assessment that we're proposing related to violence can help the Firearm Protocol itself and help implementation. Because the whole sort of underlying logic of the review mechanism is that assessment and implementation are connected. That's the logic of the review mechanism. But the more data and information of relevance that's collected and synthesized will make the analysis more robust. And I think as early implementing states begin to get a closer understanding of the impacts of what they're doing, if that can be fed back into the review process, that states that are later along, less along in the implementation process, can learn and benefit from what those early implementing states learn. And I think that the second thing I wanted to say is that and touching on the question related to GBV, I think that we can argue that states should look at these impacts and look at what researchers like us in this community can do, because it will help them in other obligations that they have. And the obvious one is the SDGs, and it has already been mentioned. We've got targets for overall levels of violence 16.1 and for illicit arms flows 16.4. But I think we also need to see whether there are aspects of the Women, Peace and Security agenda with its focus on understanding the gendered impacts of violence, including gender-based violence, but all forms of violence, and the specific role of firearms, if there's a relevance there for this research. And I think that there is. And I think that when we talk about how much, what indicators do we use and what's accessible to us, sex disaggregated data is essential in an operation like this, in a research focus like this. And even if we were to say, there's a cost benefit analysis that needs to be done, and some kinds of data are very difficult and costly to get, some are less so, and some are readily available. We could start talking about or thinking about different kinds of assessments, of sort of basic plus, and comprehensive, that have different sort of components in them and different price tags as well for the cost of conducting the research. But sex disaggregated data in terms of violence, the impacts of violence, firearm deaths, firearm non-fatal injuries, other types of violence are absolutely critical, I think. So maybe that's a bit of a response. Back to you, Anna.
Thank you very much. We are getting close to the end, but I would like to give the floor back to Nicola and Simonetta for a very, very quick response. Nicola.
Thank you, Anna. On the question of what the survey's done on this issue, I mean, we're quite involved in efforts to monitor the global indicators related to the SDGs. So obviously this is not specifically for the Firearms Protocol, but it feeds into it as we've discussed today. And so we maintain several global databases. One is the database on global violent deaths, which is an accounting of fatalities, both resulting from both homicides and conflict-related events. And the idea with that is to monitor the trends in these violent deaths over time. The database goes back to the mid-1990s. And we've been also making projections and scenarios based on the level of international engagement and government's government response to sort of see what might happen if more was being done or if nothing was being done. And that's been quite important to raise awareness of the issue. We have other databases also on firearm holdings that include civilian holdings, including unregistered holdings in some countries where we have that data. And we also have an interesting database on what we call unplanned explosions at munition sites. And that's interesting here because we know that when there's an accidental depot explosion, ammunition explosion, and that there's a lot of fatalities, that's a pretty good proxy indicator for stockpile management, because an explosion can happen anywhere, but it should not cause significant casualties if the procedures are respected. And so that's also a good indicator of the level of weapons, ammunition management in those countries, and the kind of effort that governments put into this aspect. I mentioned a little bit the work we've done last year. I mean, we do quite a bit of work with governments and national level actors, civil society, to support the development of national action plans, at the identification of indicators. When we do this, we really try to involve a range of governmental authorities, not just the security and defense forces, but also other relevant ministries, but also civil society. So I could provide more information on that. But on our website, if you look at our annual report, you will see a lot of that work cited there. And of course, we've been doing a lot of case study research, either in particular regions where there is a need for a better understanding of evolving trafficking dynamics. I mentioned the work on converted firearms in Europe, for example. But we do a lot of work now with court documents, so firearms-related cases in court documents, whether in Ukraine or the US, and that provides a wealth of information on the evolving nature of trafficking and the different types of modus operandi of the actors. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that. It's hard to answer that question very briefly when it's a 20-year-old organization. But,
Thank you, Nick. I hope they will not cut us off immediately. Simonetta, 1 minute to go.
Thank you. No, very, very quickly. On the issue of data, of course, it is not easy, but UNODC also has data on homicides which are disaggregated by gender, and at the same time, there is, of course, always room to improve the analysis also of firearms trafficking, which is right now, to some extent, looks also at gender disaggregated data when it comes to persons that come in contact with the criminal justice system because of this. But of course, more can be done also when looking at the instances in which firearms are being seized. And for example, domestic violence, we know that in many cases, victims, I mean, there are studies that show it. And I think even in the process of looking at the Firearms Protocol and its implementation through data analysis, some gender disaggregated data can be collected. Also, we also provide legislative assistance where also a gender sensitive approach can be useful. And case law analysis we are about to develop a digest of cases that involve illicit firearms. But we also have to distinguish whether these crimes, for example, against gender-based violence, were committed with legal or with illicit weapons. This is also something that would be interesting to analyze. I want to conclude just coming back to other points that were relating to the effectiveness of the review mechanism. I think the key word is constructiveness. As long as countries under review don't take this as a process where they only have to look for compliance, formal compliance with what is strictly mandatory, but take this as an opportunity to look broader at how they implement, what their institutional settings are, what the effectiveness of their information exchange and cooperation with other countries is, then the review mechanism can actually provide an excellent opportunity. And I think Emile mentioned something about the fact that can we isolate the benefit, let's say, the impact of the protocol when there are also other instruments? No, and we should not. And I always say that every international instrument has its own life and its own scope. And none is perfect because every of these instruments address specific angles. The ATT looks at the issue from the legal trade perspective, the Firearms Protocol from the organized crime perspective, etc. But national legislators, they have to have a broad approach. So they have to look at it from all angles and see what will have an impact on the lives of my citizens. So in this respect, I don't even think it's really needed to claim that the reduction of armed violence was due more to the protocol or to the ATT implementation or to the program of action implementation. There is a framework out there and countries should make the best use of them. And in fact, the protocol even invites member states to go beyond what is in the protocol. And so therefore, again, the review mechanism can provide an opportunity to look at what is strictly necessary, to look at what would be better to do beyond the protocol, and the analysis through research, data, better data, and the cooperation and dialogue also with civil society will then be the accompanying vehicle for that.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you, Simonetta. And this was a great discussion. Thank you, everybody, for responding so warmly to our invitation to think about this topic. And I think this is just the beginning of something that may develop in the coming months and possibly years, who knows. I wish to thank all the panelists and the discussants and the participants who asked the questions. I would like to thank the organizers for this great initiative. It's a fantastic opportunity. And thank you for the help from the volunteers. There is a great team of volunteers behind the scenes. They are really helping us also to overcome the IT challenges. So thank you, everybody, and all the best. Bye. Bye-bye.